Okay, hi, hello everyone, and I am continuing today. We reached the point where we were coming up to the Battle of uh, Kursk, and I gave some misinformation, which I want to correct now. And in general, the way things are set up for me, if I do give misinformation and I discover it, then pretty much at the beginning of the next program, I will correct it. Now, this battle, well, here's from the Wikipedia. It was an immensely bloody but inconclusive local engagement, which turned into a strategic defeat of the invaders, the Germans. From then on, the Germans fought a bitter and costly retreat, and the Red Army soon advanced into what Soviet propaganda called the lair of the fascist beast. In the spring of 1945, Stalin's soldiers would take Berlin and end the Second World War in Europe. The Soviets won because of their vast superiority of human and material resources. During the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army had thrown in twice as many men and guns and machines as the Germans. There were exaggerations, of course, about how many German tanks were destroyed, the Tiger tank and some other, kind of advanced tank. Maybe the Soviets' tanks were not that powerful or not as advanced, but they had so many of them and so many soldiers, and there was a delay in the attack, and that gave the Soviets an opportunity to prepare. But my mistake was that I said that this Battle of Kursk was in 1944. In fact, it was in 1943, and I just want to, so let's see here. The actual Battle of Kursk was in 1943, not 1944. I think, okay, now why that's important. By 1944, the driving back of the Germans was already well in process. It was in, the Battle of Kursk was in July and August, favorable months in terms of the weather, at least. August 1943. Now, this is interesting. The Germans had suffered such a defeat in Stalingrad that they were extremely cautious about advancing towards additional battles, and they anticipated a big one. So they delayed in their attack. This did give the Soviets opportunity to prepare in great depth upon the area that would be the the likely battlefield. And what's important about this, now think about Stalingrad and how the Tibetans said, okay, now the war is won. The sun has advanced northwards from the solstice of December, and now the battle is won. Steps were taken, and we're going to read about those steps. Steps were taken by the Lords of Liberation that made the victory of the United Nations or the Allied forces inevitable. I think what's so good about reading this book in detail is that we get to see this Armageddon, this decisive end to the long war from 1914 to 1945. We get to see it from the hierarchy's point of view, and it's sometimes a different point of view than we might be holding. So already, after the defeat at Stalingrad, yet another strategic defeat occurred for the Germans, at which time they were persistently driven back. So already the winning of the war on the inner plains began to show itself on the outer plains. And there was no way they could hold the advancing Russian forces, which outnumbered them entirely. And, of course, dealing with the Russian winter, there was nothing they could do. I'm not sure of the details of the degree, the effect that the Russian winter had in the winter of 43 and the winter of 44, but let's just say by the winter of 44, they were very, very close to Berlin. Now, yeah. Okay, well, something was on my mind there, and it went away. Let's just say that the war really was decided internally, and then the outer effects began to manifest. And of course, Hitler, as usual, megalomaniac that he was, thought he knew better than his generals and did not let a very, very skilled general, Mannheim, von Mannheim, I think that was his name, conduct that battle and that theater as he wished to do, and there might have been a victory. But even so, the Germans were hopelessly outnumbered on a two-front war, and well, in June of 1944, D-Day occurred, the invasion of Europe by the Allied forces, and so it really was a two-front war with activated forces on either side pursuing the Germans who were retreating to their central stronghold, their own country. So much for the ill-fated aggression, the Blitzkrieg, under Ares, the appropriated soul ray of the soul sign of the German group. Ares is often good at initiating, but not at holding, and they couldn't hold on a two-front war. They were overcome, and as we read, the Tibetan insisted that a surrender must be demanded, and that no cessation of the war in a kind of armistice, short of victory, should be allowed, because then the Axis powers would simply regroup and come back with a much more terrible version of the war. And while he didn't say so, I'm assuming with atomic weapons. So the last section, the last program that we read, was actually from April of 1944, and he said, look, the Germans have not been defeated. Even then, there was a central stronghold. Even in April of 1944, the Germans had not been defeated. And DK warned against this. He said it was still a danger. Okay. So I was 1 year off here, but at least the general trend was correct. The driving back of the Germans by the Russian forces, and really at the same time, and shortly after that, in 1944, after June 6th, the driving back of the Germans out of France and back into their own country, where eventually the surrender had to take place. So now we can go on. And I don't like making mistakes like that, obvious ones, but if I do, the situation is set up for me that I can't really go back and edit all this. This is, a casual conversation between us, and I say what I say, and if I make mistakes, I will, and become aware of them, I will correct them. The purpose of it all is to become more deeply familiar with what DK said in the externalization of the hierarchy, which maybe is not read so much because it seems to be localized in time, to have to do with specific outer events. But that's not really the case. As a matter of fact, his emphasis upon the outer events is very little, and the esoteric meanings are what he discusses. So now we have the task of implementing the will to good, that great force of will, which I think carries a combination, in my view, of the first ray and the second ray. Although in the trio of the good, the beautiful, and the true, the good is the first ray in that trio. But from another perspective, the good has to do with a patterning of relationships. And that patterning immediately suggests the second ray, the ray of the divine pattern, the ray of right relationship. So many of the archetypes are found on the monadic plane, which is a combination of the first and the second ray. And the archetypes are the celestial patterns which must be enacted or made to be manifest in time and space at the right time and in the right space. The entire archetype will be spread out over time and space and will not occur immediately. Nevertheless, the monadic plane and the monads thereon have something of the second ray quality in addition to the first. And if we're looking for the pure first ray, we should go to the logoic plane, at least the pure first ray on the cosmic physical plane. So, May 1944, we're getting close to D-Day here. There's been so many films, that have portrayed this, and maybe one of the most vivid recently was Saving Private Ryan, in which Tom Hanks was the major star there, had the leading role. It was just, what happened on those beaches was ghastly, especially, for those, well, it was just ghastly, and for those who do not or did not know the occult underpinnings of the outer form, it was even a greater sacrifice. The Germans had been fooled somewhat, but they were still lying in wait. And there was just slaughter upon the beaches. But again, the numbers of the Allied forces making that attack were overwhelming in terms of the defenses against them. It might be, we've been a warring kingdom, the human kingdom, and it might be very significant that the war should shift up onto the higher planes and away from the bloodshed on the dense physical plane, which no doubt has been going on for millions of years. The era of peace, which the Christ will introduce with Satan or the personality being bound for 1,000 years, this might be quite a new thing for the human race, for which every century seems to have its wars. Okay, May 1944, and let's just say like 1 month before D-Day. Every time I use the word letter D, I get a disciple out of it, okay? But that's my little code. How is the hierarchy working at this time? Asked the Tibetan. In what manner are the masters aiding the work of the forces of light? And he defined these as the fighting forces of the United Nations or allies. Remember, just a little earlier, he tried to clarify that. Well, the forces of light is a term that can be applied to many levels, but he was applying it to the representatives of the masters and, in a way, the representatives of still higher forces of light that are found upon monadic plane and above. So the masters are behind these armies of light. Let's just put that in. The masters are behind the armies of light. And it reminds me, but the Christ is said to be the supreme commander of the forces of light. Certainly it was so during the war, and, I think in a larger sense as well. Can something of moment and of lasting significance happen at this coming May full moon? How do the masters look at the world situation? What are their plans? Can these plans be materialized? And what can the individual disciple, initiate, and world disciple, maybe a world disciple there, can be considered a third degree initiate in this context, accomplish in the face of humanity's dilemma? So these are all questions that DK would like now to address, and let's see what he says. Number one, the outcome of the coming climaxing conflict. Indeed, heading toward the end now, depends on humanity itself. A greater effort is required, particularly in America, an effort to see the issues clearly, to understand the causes of this war, and a determination to take those steps through propaganda, propagating of ideas, It's not necessarily, all propaganda is not necessarily evil, it's the propagation of ideas. To take those steps through propaganda and discussion which will clarify the minds of the masses. Into these age-long causes I cannot here go. There is not time to do more than enumerate certain of them. So should we say, the responsibility, okay, RSPY, that makes me wonder what is going on here. RSPY, okay, right, sorry, there was a little interruption there. Well, anyway, the responsibility is with humanity itself. That's what he's telling us. And always, somehow in these conflicts, America seems to be the laggard United States. A greater effort is required, particularly in America, an effort to see the issues clearly and to understand the causes of this war, and a determination to take those steps through propaganda and discussion which will clarify the minds of the masses. And he's going to mention maybe a few of the age-long causes, but not get into it very deeply because there is no time. Obviously the Tibetan is always working under time constraints, and I think if we saw what it is these masters had to do, we would be, staggered by their workload. Anyway, what are the causes? Age-long causes. I'll kind of build up that one. Okay. So A, the universal and ancient selfishness. I mean, universal means it affects everybody on the planet. That's one way of looking at it. We're not talking about the entire universe here. Universal and ancient selfishness, materialism, aggression, and national prides. Of these faults, all nations have been guilty, just as all individuals at a certain stage of their unfoldment have been guilty. B. A sense of separateness, of which the border issue between such nations as Russia and Poland is symbolic. The need of humanity and its general well-being comes eternally first. Nations and their ephemeral disputes are of secondary interest. Well, there's, of course, a much freer condition in Poland at this time, but there was pretty much the overtaking of a certain area of Poland by the USSR. So what are the keys are this sense of selfishness. Okay, that's one of them. A sense of separateness, which is due to the way we perceive our identity. We look at ourselves as tiny separate units of life. We don't realize, that that in a way the Christ is the tree and we are the branch. We are the branches. Or any great source being is the fountain of the life, and all extensions from it are really the branches and the leaves. So the age-long causes, a tendency centuries old among the Germanic peoples to dominate, to take what is not their own, to regard themselves as unique, superior, and embodying a super race. Now, whoa, that's not it, is it? Okay. I'm just trying to, okay, what is this? No, that's it. Sorry, different activities come into the mix here. Life goes on, even as I'm trying to prepare these things for you. So, a tendency centuries old among the Germanic peoples to dominate, to take what is not their own, to regard themselves as unique, superior, and as embodying a super race. Well, let's just note that. And we'll also say they have a first ray personality, as does the UK. So it's interesting to see these two great competitors face off during the First World War and the Second World War. Basically, Germany found itself on the side of the dominating personality rather than the soul. And we can say that of the whole Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Turkey was involved with them as well. But in fact, the side of the soul, even in the earlier phase of the conflict, was taken by the Allies, England, France, and the United States, and some others, with the tremendous help of Australia and New Zealand and Canada, all of those associated with the United Kingdom. So this is interesting, and the problem comes from the first solar system. Whoop, that's not it. Those are the 7 solar system, the first solar system, because he says, he tells us how the Jews from the first solar system and the Germans, they are really brothers, all of the same family. And so this inheriting of the dominating aspect, also, the soul of Judea has the first ray connected with it, the first ray soul, whereas Germany has the first ray personality and the UK as well. So this has been ongoing, apparently, and the causes of it, I think, lie in the distant past. There was also a fixed determination on behalf of their own interests to plunge other nations and races into war, and today they have achieved a planetary war, under the tendencies, well, what should we call them, of Bismarck, who was an avatar, a human avatar of the Black Lodge. So these tendencies have come to a head in the Second World War. We don't see Germany behaving in that way any longer. Maybe the soul begins to take over. So much was attempted to bring the beauty aspect of the German soul forward, and the beauty aspect of many nations, Germany, Austria, the great composers were there, and artists were there in the 19th century, coming in, we are told, ahead of their predestined time to see if blood and iron, the Martian influence, might not be offset, but it was not sufficiently offset. Okay, so we have really here 3 reasons, okay? What about how is the hierarchy working at this time? In what manner are the masters aiding the forces of light? This is instructive. Can something of lasting moment be done? And what can the individual disciple and initiate accomplish, etc., in facing humanity's dilemma? These are all normal and intelligent questions and can be answered partially, owing, though not fully, owing to 3 reasons. So we'll take a look at that and what the 3 reasons might be that provide partial answers. So the very first one, of course, is the idea that the outcome depends upon humanity. I think we're so, as human beings, so loath to accept responsibility and somehow think we'll be protected from ourselves and saved by the powers that be. So these are the problems. Selfishness, separateness, and the Germanic tendency toward aggression. Now we can only, as I say, we can hope that with the emphasis on the 4th ray soul now, perhaps they have outgrown this. Certainly it seems that this is the case. Every once in a while something will come in from the side, telling what time and space we are occupying at the moment, but I'll just get rid of those announcements as soon as possible. Okay. Now, 3 reasons. That's what we're basically looking at. The first, dependence on humanity. Okay, so let's call this, in a way, the first reason. The next, there are factors present in this battle between evil and good, which are so deeply esoteric and hidden from the understanding of the most advanced human being that it is useless for me to enlarge upon their existence. Well, people like ourselves who are into the teaching, maybe a little bit can come through to us. We've certainly learned about Atlantis and Lemuria, and we've learned about the failure on the moon chain, and we've learned about the failure and rebellion in the previous solar system, from which quite a number of human units have migrated, if we can call it that. So there's a partial answering of how we can assist. Can these plans be materialized? And what can we do? And there's a partial revelation of what can we do, but not a full revelation. Okay. Okay. So the next factor here, the second factor, is this ancient esoteric origin beyond even the most advanced human being. And let's ask, are initiates included? That it is useless for me to enlarge upon their existence. They are concerned with the ability of the mind or the mind principle to react to truth or to lies. The mystery of this is hidden, this reaction is hidden in the evolutionary process itself. A point can be reached in human development where acceptance of deception is impossible and clear thinking is normal. The potency of glamour, which holds so many people in prison, is related to this mystery. Glamour holds not only those who are mentally and emotionally undeveloped, they are complete realists. Glamour holds not those who are mentally and emotionally underdeveloped, or undeveloped. I'm having a little trouble with this one. They are complete realists and see life in its bare outlines and baldly. The highly developed are not subject to glamour. They also think realistically, but this time with true mental perception and not instinctively. The thinking man in his process of training, but who is still largely governed by his emotions, is exceedingly prone to glamour and very often to the glamour of a sentimental so-called loving attitude. These people do not realize that love is a process of determining action on the basis of the ultimate good of the individual or the group, and that the immediate reactions of the personality are secondary. Okay, so I think I'm going to, the undeveloped don't have it, the well-developed don't have it, but those who are in the middle have it, and have it in kind of an extreme version at the present time. Okay, so it is a factor involving evolutionary development. The mystery of this reaction is hidden in the evolutionary process itself. It's the condition of our perceptual apparatus, our interpretive apparatus, which makes us prone to glamour and illusion and creates action in the myopic worlds, which holds humanity back from true and intended evolution. In this conflict, the hierarchy is concerned with the final issue, with the future welfare and the ultimate well-being of humanity. They are not so concerned with the immediate suffering and pain of the personalities involved. Is this a hard saying? I suppose many would consider it a hard saying, because we are without clear perception, viewing a situation in which we can have very little understanding of the final outcome. We are sentimental in our assessment of what is happening, and for us, the sufferings of the personality are all important, forgetting that our true identity is not that of the personality. So a sentimental, and very often to the glamour of a sentimental, so-called loving attitude. This is a problem. So love, and here's a good definition, is a process of determining action on the basis of the ultimate good of the individual or the group, and that the immediate reaction of the personality reactions are secondary. That's very hard, I think, for the attached human being to realize. I think very difficult. And yet we have to develop a non-sentimental response. Well, that's the very first of 4 eliminations that can take place before the process offered in Rule 11 of the rays and the initiations can manifest as it should manifest. We get rid of that sentimental assessment. We cut the strictly personality ties between group members. We learn to work as a miniature hierarchy without the liabilities of jealousy, envy, all those things. And finally, we learn how to speak to each other and how to think, observing the necessity of the true meaning of occult silence. So, when I came to work at the Arcane School, just like everybody else, I was hauled into the main office, and Mary Bailey emphasized Rule 11, as if it were really our possibility. Of course, it's speaking of a 4th degree initiate group, or of a becoming 4th degree initiate group. It was not possible for any of these discipleship groups on the planet right now to achieve this. Maybe certain ashramic groups can achieve it. But, of course, there was an emphasis, and the emphasis alerted you to the importance of this rule. So, in our own life, can we be concerned with the final issues? In our own life, can this be so? Or do we become waylaid and ensnared in the unpleasant possibilities that may befall the personality? Somehow we have to see through this, and we have to learn how to identify as the one within. When Christ says that the kingdom of heaven is within, what heaven is he talking about? He's not just talking about something that you die to and spend some time before your next incarnation. He's speaking about the causal field, where a higher type of identity exists for us within our egoic lotus. That particular 3rd heaven is within, and we have to get used to the idea of an internal kingdom in which we are residents, and we have to be able to not deal with it only mentally, but experientially within the causal body. Going on. A tiny replica of this correct attitude can be found in the influence, words, and actions of those wise parents, those far-sighted guides of youth, who see the need of discipline if their children are in the future to be rightly oriented and to live correctly. The temporary discomfort of the discipline and the rebellion of the children do not in any way condition such parents. They see ahead. So there's an analogy I think we can all understand, and sometimes, we call this by an interesting name. It's maybe a more modern name. We call this tough love, because we really do love, and we see what should happen if we are too permissive with the tendencies which must be eradicated. So it's the same. The analogy holds, and what hierarchy allows to happen may seem very, very drastic and terrible, but in the long run, that which befalls the personality protects the expression of the soul and facilitates the building of soul quality. So basically here, I'm going to enlarge this a little bit. So far, we're dealing with this, the normal and intelligent questions, and those questions are about, what can we do, and how the masters look at things, and what are their plans, and how is the master working, hierarchy working at this time. All of these questions will receive a partial answer, and it cannot be fully answered because certain things are not, let's just say that we have but a partial answer because the issue had not yet been decided by humanity itself. Humanity itself. So that's one reason for an indicative, though partial answer. And there's another factor. Why partial answer? Because the disciples themselves can't understand what a full answer would be. A partial answer is given because the disciples themselves cannot understand. Okay, and let's see if we can look at the next one in the same light. The next one is, let's see. Okay. The conflict at present involving humanity has its source not only in human weakness and selfishness, but in a situation which has existed for ages between the Great White Lodge and the Lodge of Black Adepts. Yes, maybe this is another reason why only a partial answer to the very legitimate questions we as disciples do not know enough about the Black Lodge, and we should not know too much, as it is dangerous. How do you say? Speculation anent which is both fruitless and dangerous. So there is this battle going on this warring planet, and hardly any human beings are aware of it, and those who are entering occult training become aware of part of it, but not all of it. We don't need to know the names and locations and characters of these individualities, these selfish, hateful, wicked individualities because it could serve to put us en rapport with them, and that rapport could be dangerous for us because they are far more powerful than we are at the present time. So all this started in, okay, we should not know too much, as it is dangerous. Well, can knowledge be a dangerous thing? And are there some phases of knowledge which we should not possess given our temporary condition and the developmental issues upon which we have to focus? And I would say the answer is yes. This conflict between the Great White Lodge of Masters and the Lord of Black Adepts, or the wonderfully evocative names Lords of the Shining Countenance and Lords of the Dark Face. Pretty dramatic. And, if I must say so somehow, expressed for us in the recent films in the Star Wars series. This started in Atlantean times and must now be fought out to the finish, although, frankly, there are going to be difficulties that lie ahead until the Judgment Day, when I think all such beings will be banished, all such individualities will have no more sway. And just think what it'll be like then to pass through the phases of development without the opposition of such malevolent beings. I think much faster and much more effective. So he says it has to be fought out to the finish. Now, did that happen? With the details, okay, well, I'm going to make this bigger. At least there was a conclusive victory at this time, although, as stated, the door was left ajar for their re-entry. Human selfishness had not been overcome to the degree necessary. With the details of this struggle fought on mental planes, you have no concern, except insofar as you and the rest of mankind react to lies or to truth. Okay, so there is a mental battle within the greater battle. Two streams of mental energy and of thought-directed ideas impinge powerfully at this time upon the human consciousness. You're reminded in a way that the mental plane is divided. Well, let's just see if I can. Yeah, the mental plane is divided, and here are the AAB diagrams, and let's see if I can find this. I think so. There we are. And here are the divisions of physical and mental systemic planes, and certainly the abstract mind and the higher mind already begin to think in terms of the soul, but not the concrete mind. So there is a division right there. This business of the 13th sphere, really the 8th sphere or the 13th, depending on how we count, a great tragedy would occur were the concrete mind to be sealed off as a as an impenetrable sphere in its own right. It would become another factor, and the Black Lodge would have a place from which to work powerfully. So two streams of mental energy or of thought-directed ideas impinge powerfully upon the human consciousness. One is embodied in the lying propaganda emanating from the Axis powers and affecting potently not only their own people, but the selfish politicians, the intolerant and the racially conditioned people, and the well-intentioned but short-sighted appeasers and pacifists. And we might say that, okay, let me get this straight here, that this particular stream has to do with the concrete mind, and certainly has nothing in it that is soul related. It's a distortion of whatever the soul might otherwise present. The second stream is embodied in the idealism. See right there, we're reaching upward. The humanitarianism under the soul, of course, and the clear presentation of the factual situation which characterizes the best minds in every nation, and which condition the thinking of the leaders of the United Nations. This stream has, for instance, conditioned the attitude and the changed orientation of the USSR and has brought them to a position of cooperation and to a relinquishing of some of their separative ideas. These may have reoccurred immediately after the war and their victory. It seemed that, as long as Stalin was in power, which would be, let's see, did he die in 53 or something like that? Maybe 8 years after the war concluded, that this policy of domination and of separatism, the worst of the Leo traits of the Russian personality, would still be in effect. So this is the second stream, and interesting that there was a change in the position of the USSR. Maybe some of it was simply for self-preservation, I think. But anyway, they were responding to the second stream. And of course, they exaggerated and they hyped their propaganda and, with their tendency towards drama and the sixth ray personality and the sixth ray astral body, probably things were inflated. Assessment of the situation was inflated and presented in very dramatic terms to the people. But then Russia lost more than Soviet Union, lost more than any other group in that war. The number of fatalities was astonishing. So the Black Lodge of Adepts, this is, in a way, the third reason why we can know something but not everything about the situation, because we just don't know how the Black Lodge works. We don't. Maybe they know more, of course. And we don't have to be connected with a study of the 12 selfish individualities that are responsible for this Black Lodge attack, this attack really of cosmic evil. Okay, I hope that that bell that is making my head addled is not audible by you. All right. So So now we have some idea of how to understand, in part, at least an answer to these questions that can legitimately be asked. How is hierarchy working? How do the masters aid the forces of light, the representatives on the physical plane and in the personality of humanity who are carrying on the expression of the forces of light? How do we use these full moons? This next one especially. How are the masters really seeing the world situation? What are their plans? Can their plans be successfully materialized? And what can we do? These are questions that we are answering partially, but not in full, and the reasons for not answering them in full are being stated here in this number 1, 2, and 3. Namely, that we are responsible ourselves and we have not made the decision. That is, humanity was responsible. Secondly, because of the deeply esoteric nature of the conflict between the battle between good and evil. And thirdly, because we must not learn too much about the Black Lodge, lest we put ourselves en rapport with this group. The interesting thing is, DK says it must be fought to the finish. Now, I guess our question has to be, has it really been fought to the finish? Because we seem to be involved somehow in a third aspect of this great conflict between good and evil, even though it is more subtle and not a shooting war on the outer plane. The leader of the conflict against evil in high places is the Christ, the head of the hierarchy. Now, this is an amazing statement. He is the commander of the armies of the Lord, of the forces of light as they appear upon the physical plane. The leader is the Christ. And what methods he uses, how can we know? We cannot know. We could not even know, we could not know what the methods were that were used by the Lords of Liberation to deflect the inquiring minds of the German scientists away from the secret of releasing the energy of the atomic energy in a weapon. What is the attitude of the Christ at this time? Remember that the Tibetan said, "The Christ is my master," he said. In all reverence and as one of the humblest friends and personal workers, his humblest friends and personal workers, I am permitted to tell you a little of his position as he nears the great event in May of this year. Notice how very careful the Tibetan is about representing the Christ and what he is allowed or permitted to say. He knows himself to be the inner spiritual commander of the armies of the Lord. His is the responsibility of awakening the souls of men to their present opportunity and to the need of bringing to an end this ancient conflict between the lords of evil and the messengers of light. His has been the problem of teaching humanity that, in order to demonstrate true love and to provide scope and opportunity for a civilization in which love, brotherhood, and right human relations are governing factors, those essential steps must be taken which will accomplish this. So a little bit is being shared here about what the Christ does. Okay. And let's see if we learn anything about how he does it, Yes, this is a paragraph that has made an impression upon me. And let's just say that right now we are at the 1 hour point. I'm not sure how far I can go with this today. Maybe just an hour and a half. He knows himself to be the inner spiritual commander of the armies of the Lord. Well, that's such a declarative, bold statement, asserting the fact of this. His is the responsibility of awakening the souls of men to their presented opportunity, which still exists now, and to the need of bringing to an end this ancient conflict between the lords of evil and the messengers of light. It's still being fought out on the plane of mind, emotions, and in the Maya of the etheric body. His has been the problem of teaching humanity that, in order to demonstrate true love and to provide scope and opportunity for a civilization in which love, brotherhood, and right relations are governing factors, those essential steps must be taken which will accomplish this. Okay. He said, when he was on earth 2,000 years ago, I came to bring not peace, but a sword. The sword of the Spirit is wielded by the hierarchy, and by its means, cosmic evil is arrested. So it's not only the sword of discrimination, but the sword of the Spirit. And I think I'll just make a note of that, not only the sword of discrimination between good and evil, but also the sword of the Spirit. So hierarchy wields the sword of spirit, and by its means, cosmic evil is arrested. The sword of discrimination is wielded by the initiates and the disciples of the world, and by its means, the distinction between good and evil, with a consequent presentation of free choice between the two, has been laid before humanity, and the lines of demarcation have been made abundantly clear in this world war. So this is just a note about the power of the sword of discrimination wielded by lesser beings than he. He wields the sword of the Spirit. Okay. So it's wielded by hierarchy. Okay. I think I'll just, hard to say what color to use here, because there are only certain colors that really shine, I'll try that one. Why not? The sword of the Spirit. It had been the hope of the Christ and the longing of all the masters that men would see clearly and make free and right choice, so that without physical plane warfare they would bring about the needed changes and the ending of wrong conditions. But the conflict descended on the physical plane, and the sword of material war, symbolically speaking, was taken up by humanity. So what we have here is two kinds of swords. Well, actually, two kinds of swords of, yeah, two kinds of swords, spirit and discrimination, and also the sword of war. And do we even today know the real distinction between good and evil? When I look at some of the voting patterns of the people in various countries, I feel that they are bewildered and they do not know the difference. They do not know how to discriminate between good and evil. But the sword of the Spirit, this is something else, and by its means, in a battle fought out within Shambhala, cosmic evil can be arrested. So the arresting of cosmic evil is the task of Shambhala. Well, apparently humanity did not really live up to the hope which was possible. It is so often the case that a certain proportion of achievement arises and is brought to a successful end, but a little bit is left over. And with that little bit, the door ajar, as it were, cosmic evil can put its foot in the doorway and again seek entrance. I picked up a film the other day, not a great film, but it was Achilles, and it was speaking of the Trojan War. And, beware of the Greeks bearing gifts is the old saying about that Odysseus' third-rate tendency to be very clever. And in this case, the Greeks were very clever and said, we're going home, but here is a gift saluting your bravery in battle. And the Trojans were proud enough to accept it, and not so many men were inside that horse, but enough. And they themselves could not have overcome the forces within Troy, but they opened the main gate to the city. There were enough to open the main gate to the city and allow the entire Greek army to descend not just upon the city, but to enter within the city and defeat the unaware Trojan forces which had been taken by surprise. Well, anyway, in the 1930s, a great emphasis was placed upon goodwill. And we know how the Tibetans spoke and how the energy of love was so prominent. And the great invocation, stanza 1, 1935, was brought forth and to be used in a great climaxing year of love and goodwill, 1936. But as the Tibetan explains in various places, not enough disciples threw themselves into it. Now, immediately we have to think about disciples' activity today, when all the rumblings, or so many of the fascist and Nazi rumblings, can be heard. Racial warfare is in the minds of many, and it involves the white man and everybody else. Okay. There it comes, racism complaints. Well, okay. So, these are the ways that the Black Lodge works, seeking to divide group from group within humanity and then stoking misunderstanding and the thought that only by violence can there be a solution. as with this man who just a few days ago killed 50 Muslim people at prayer in 2 mosques. Following that, someone killed a man from Turkey, killed 3 and wounded 5, 6 on a tram in Utrecht in Holland. And there have been others. One has not to become numb to this constant carnage. Imagining somehow that by eliminating a few people, that one's objectives can be met, and they are distorted objectives and cruel objectives. So the shallow thinking and the incendiary response of the astral body, these prompt certain types of people to fly into action, invidious action, infamous action that is against the coming together of the groups and the races in harmony and in cooperation. And those are the negative forces still at battle. So we cannot relax. We cannot take our eyes away. We cannot think that because the Second World War is called Armageddon, that all has been decided. And as a matter of fact, maybe the war has, as I say, three parts to it, possibly 3 parts. Forget not, particularly those of you who are outraged by physical conflict through your pacifist inclinations, that in the West it was Germany which first of all took the sword in hand, marching into Poland and bringing misery, devastation, and cruelty to a smaller and much weaker nation, thus forcing France and Britain to fulfill their pledged obligations to that little nation and to declare war upon the aggressor. It was Japan who brought war into the Eastern Hemisphere. The forces of light were left with no alternative but to fight in defense of freedom. This has to be remembered by the pacifist and by the unrealistic idealist, by the excessive lover, well, a lover who loves the form excessively and forgets the true spiritual nature of man behind it. Well, perhaps there was an advantage to the cleansing activity of Shambhala that the war did precipitate, and that the broom of God really swept the situation clean. But then, since the door was left ajar, the ancient selfishness again entered and still controls humanity. The principle of sharing is not there. The degree of peace required for the Christ to return has not been achieved. But there is some cleansing of the political and the religious households. That much, maybe we relate it to the third aspect of those 3 requirements. That much is occurring. Okay, prior to the war, hierarchy did what it could to change the trend of human living and thinking, awakening the consciousness or the consciences. That's the voice of the soul, we might say. So I'll kind of define that. The voice of the soul. awakening the consciences of the intelligent, stimulating the activity of the humanitarians, and impressing the minds of their disciples, hierarchy's disciples, in order to arouse goodwill, a driving desire for right human relations and peaceful conditions. But the movement was not strong enough. The sword appeared on earth, and mankind was plunged into war. A war which I think is conditioning in the psyches of many of us. It's difficult to know where one's incarnations were placed. So often when one assesses incarnations, it's a bit of a hunch, it's wish fulfillment, it's the following out of some inclinations, and we don't know for certain. Although in the new esoteric schools, DK tells us that the method of reacquiring understanding or reacquiring the experiences of the earlier incarnations will be taught. So something really reliable, and we will know at least the most conditioning incarnations. That is what we need. Well, anyway, this was prior to the war. Attempts were made, and we just have to say the response was too weak to stop the lifting of the sword by Germany. Well, it was a real onslaught, of course, and the whole idea that many of the German leaders were actually possessed by these dark individualities gives us some idea of what the men and women of goodwill would be fighting against. Not to make excuses, but certainly a degree of goodwill beyond what they normally would express was required. Since then, the work of impressing the minds of the world disciples and of those whom they can influence has been along the lines of clarifying the issues, making plain that for which we fight, and arousing men and women to take such action as will, once and for all, end the possibility of a similar world cataclysm. So, first, goodwill was attempted and love, but then, after this first attempt failed, we needed clarification. Okay. The activities now, okay, so this is how the work was done, and we've seen in reading this that DK has really attempted to clarify the mind of the reader to the issues involved. He's done what he could do and continues to do so, as the book evolves and we talk about the whole externalization and reappearance process. It was the battle which led, if won, and it was won, to the possibility and indeed the certainty of the externalization of the hierarchy and the reappearance of the Christ. Now, this time he calls the Christ our master, which is also correct. The head of the hierarchy, his master, our master, and very much the master of those who are his disciples, the Christ disciples, within the spiritual hierarchy. And among those who are the Christ disciples, we find more realistically our particular master, our guide, our teacher. No doubt the Master Gurumi considers the Christ to be his master. And the Tibetan considers both the Christ and the Master Kutumi to be his master, but the Christ in a larger, to a larger extent, and in greater proportion. So the activities of our master, the Christ, fall into three categories. What are these? Stiffening the will to fight on behalf of the spiritual issues and for the great humanitarian aims of hierarchy. After all, he is the commander of the forces of light, as they represent these higher forces of light. So maybe it's hard to think that the Christ would incline towards the battle, but thus it is, realizing that the alternative would be the failure of the entire process of creating Earth humanity on this fourth globe, and the experiment would have to be undertaken again, maybe in a different way. So stiffening the will, that's one of the things that the activities of the Christ will do. And then impressing the minds of diplomats, thinkers, and lovers of mankind to work out now certain post-war plans, which will entirely change our present civilization and bring about the new. Okay. Impressing the minds. Even at this stage in the war, May 1944, to begin assuming the factual nature of the conclusion of the war and to work out the plans which will bring in the new civilization. So, when you think about those people who founded the United Nations, you think about Eleanor Roosevelt and her associates. Such people were impressed by the mind of the Christ. Arousing the minds of the masses and turning them each in his own place and manner into a more religious channel, to connect with the higher sources. The growth of spiritual desire and aspiration is phenomenal today, could you but see the indications as the workers on the inner side do see it. So, let's see here. Stiffening the will, impressing the minds. I'll make that a little bigger. And finally, working with the masses and turning them in a more religious direction so that they can reunite with their spiritual source, the activities of the Christ. Okay, so these are the activities of the Christ, even now, even in May of 1944. Fight to the end and win, plan for the future, and become more intent on a spiritual approach to the realities of life for the masses. The growth of spiritual desire, really, it did amazingly 20 years later, really blossom. And that's when the Christ took on the vestures of the Buddha. The late 60s were the period of this blossoming and started a whole movement in consciousness which was more intense earlier than now, but still has had a very conditioning effect. Arouse the minds of the masses and turning them, each in his own place and manner, into a more religious channel. Not necessarily a church channel. I think that has to be understood. A church channel, but a channel which includes many types of spirituality, the basic improvement of the human energy system and consciousness, and of the outer circumstances in which humanity lives. So we can't see it as they do. It's just like when the Tibetans said, look, many more people are reading my books than you can possibly imagine. But we just have a slight understanding of who those people might be. Around us, some people read the books, but he sees the wholeness of it. And here's another one. Our Master the Christ is also at this time carrying forward three major activities. I can tell you briefly what they are, but only the disciples of the world will grasp the true implications. Three more activities by the Christ. Okay. Three major activities. In addition to the three listed above, three tasks listed above. He is first of all occupied with the process of deflecting the will energy emanating from Shambhala in such a way that it will not be seized and misused by the Axis powers in order to stiffen their people into increased opposition to the forces of light. This is amazing. Just as he guided the aspiration of the masses towards the lords of liberation, he is involved in deflecting the very dangerous Shambhala energy from strengthening the hands of those who work against the forces of light and human betterment, deflecting the will energy in such a way that it will not be seized upon by the Axis powers. You know, when you think of the Christ as the commander of the forces of light and you read of such activities, we understand that he took very, very serious action. It must be rechanneled and used to stiffen the purpose of the United Nations, to carry the war to a finish of victory and of triumph, to increase the will to unity of all the allied peoples and make firm the intention of the post-war planners that freedom, educational facilities, truth, and right living shall be the lot of the incoming generation. This necessitates on the part of the Christ a concentration for which we have no equivalent word, and a purely spiritual endeavor, a monadic effort of which even the Tibetan, he's including himself, of which we have no faintest idea. So I'm going to divide this up just a little bit. It's an amazing paragraph about how the Christ has worked for humanity. An amazing paragraph. And then finally, this supreme monadic effort that, well, is the Tibetan identifying with us when he says this? Or, you know, could he understand? Maybe yes, maybe no. He's not yet at the purpose where at the place where he can go on to the astral plane. So his first task, the Christ's first additional of three tasks, well, I just want to make these three major activities. I want to make this very emphatic so we know what we're looking at here below. deflecting. That's the first verb there. Deflecting the will energy. Because after all, energy is neutral, and it's possible that those evil individualities could try to deflect it towards their representatives on the outer plane. So that's the first factor. And what is this concentration that he employs? That is an amazing thought, and the Tibetan seems to not offer a lot of explanation. This is the end of 1.5 hours. I was planning to stop here, but I think I had better go ahead just a little bit in terms of the 3 additional activities. And we're not going to finish this, obviously, in this program unless I made it, as I sometimes do, a 5-hour program, which I'm probably not going to have the time to do. The cycle of conferences, notice how there is a jump here from May of 1944 to March of 1945. Well, that's just 1 month before victory. Or should we say the fall of Berlin and the escape or suicides of the major characters who led the aggression against humanity. So I won't probably be able to finish all this right now by any means. The second activity of the Christ, he's working within the confines of hierarchy itself, preparing his disciples, the masters, for certain great post-war events. For this war will end. Okay, so DK assures us of the ending of the war, and by now, it's become pretty clear, although it will be later that he explains how it came to pass when he talks about the release of atomic energy, preparing his disciples, the masters, for certain great post-war events. For this war will end. So this is the second factor of those 3. DK has so many outlines, that it's easy to get tangled up in them, unless maybe one is very well endowed with the 7th ray, which I can only hope and pray for one fine day. The restoration of the mysteries, the initiation of those disciples who have stood firm and unafraid during the war, the enlargement of their ashrams, the master's ashrams, owing to the almost unforeseen development of the spiritual sense among the world aspirants who would not normally have become disciples during this incarnation, just the same way, in a certain sense, as that Atlantean war made it possible for many to take initiation, and then the amazing thing, who would not even now be treading that path. But this is an analogy here. The enlargement of their ashrams, owing to the almost unforeseen development of the spiritual sense among the world aspirants who would not normally have become disciples during this incarnation, and also the externalization of their ashrams during the next 100 years. Okay, that's very interesting. In preparation, well, this would taking us to 2140s, to the 2140s, or a little beyond if everything has occurred as it should. After all, if the Christ is to appear at the beginning, let us say, of the Aquarian Age, all of those preparations by the masters in the 5 planetary centers have to be accomplished, have to be achieved, preparatory to the reappearance of the hierarchy upon Earth. Okay. These are some of his present hierarchical responsibilities. These involve a tremendous expenditure of force, of second-ray energy, just as his first activity demands an unusual expenditure of first-ray power, something which even he, in his high place, is only now learning to handle as a pledged disciple of Sanat Kumara. Boy, amazing thoughts, really. The Christ as a pledged disciple of Sanat Kumara. Amazing thought. Okay, the expenditure of first-ray power. I'm just going to make that bigger. And I seem to want to put it in that color. And here is the second ray force being spent so that all of these activities within the hierarchy can take place. We really have no idea of what the Christ is doing. And, the Tibetans seem to hint that it's even a bit beyond what the masters can understand. So the restoration of the mysteries, the enlargement of the ashrams, the rapid development of aspirants who would not now become disciples, let's say steadfast in their discipleship, even during this incarnation. War somehow, it has that effect of calling out the best or the worst in people. And, the Atlantean War quotation is, just amazing. Because that war that the Mahabharata dramatizes took place 4 million years ago, maybe, and to think that certain people stepped on the path of initiation who would even not now, let's say in the 20th century, be treading that path is amazing. So maybe something of what Master Moria says, the worse the better, is somehow true. So anyway, okay, the Christ work. This is the Christ's work within hierarchy itself. Now there's a third activity. His third activity is the effort to offset the growing hate in the world, to strengthen the trend towards unity, and to show people everywhere the danger of separateness. I mean, this really applies to today because the hate in the world is growing as the races and cultures are set against each other by Black Lodge activity, no doubt. So to offset the hate in the world, and DK has been doing his best there too. We can see that through his writings. But today there are people who are fomenting that hate. I'm talking about 2019, and I'm talking about this third phase, as I seem to think of it, in the fighting of the Great War, the Armageddon, or at least what DK has called the Armageddon, and what some representatives in Agni Yoga have called the Armageddon. I mentioned, in the Star Wars movies, how the evil emperor tried to get Luke Skywalker to hate but did not succeed. So, hate is the danger. And right now, with so many atrocious things happening, the killing of innocent people, everybody has their karma, of course, but the killing and prayer of innocent people, this is a sign of the growing hate, and it's justified by a level of identification which is untrue. We don't identify as the one within. We identify with the racial form, which is a type of materialism. A growing and, from the worldly point of view, reasonable hatred of the German people and of the Japanese is steadily rising. This hate they have brought upon themselves, hate ever lacks discrimination. Okay, this they have brought upon themselves. Well, and the Christ, the Lord of love, is fighting against this, as we would expect of him, because when hate is unleashed in humanity, a total destruction is possible. Hate ever lacks discrimination. The great law of retribution requires that justice be meted out, but hatred will close the eyes of justice. The law must be administered, and the world will see the expression of that same law stated in the words, "Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." But the materialistic law of hate and of separation must be negated and offset. Otherwise, it can even interfere with the justice to be meted out. Well, okay. Let's put this in about hatred. It is the fifth head of the Hydra, and I remember the Dalai Lama examining himself in relation to certain character foibles, and he came to hate, and he says, hate? No, not much, no. It was, this is a picture of a man with a real sense of proportion. The problem with which the Christ is faced is well nigh from the human angle insoluble. He will require the united effort of all men of goodwill to stem the rising tide of hate, the floodgates of which were opened by Germany when she began her attacks upon the Jews. She is now in danger of drowning in the waters in which she has set loose. There is also a rising tendency to separation among certain of the allied nations with which the Christ must deal. Several of them are as houses divided against themselves. Such are Poland, France, Yugoslavia now, and Greece. How can their differences be reconciled? Very, very practical work and not capable of solution by humanity at the time or even now with humanity's knowledge and abilities. How the Christ does this, we do not know. But the requirement is that men and women of goodwill help him, and that the new group of world servers helps him. And this is even today, when there are groups that simply wish to foment hate between the races, between the cultures. They wish to foment separation and race war, cultural war, a clash of civilizations. The good and the bad within every civilization, every culture, every race must be located, found, and seen with understanding, with objectivity, and then the evil eliminated, if it can be seen and understood. Maybe a little bit more before we close here. There's too much to continue, I fear. The hate of those who have suffered at the hands of the Axis powers or as a result of war conditions must be offset. So this hate that arises in those who have suffered is very understandable. Um, I did live through a lot of that myself, with my relatives and whose families were destroyed in the war and so forth. Um, and I saw it took a long time to die down, The hatred against Germany, for instance, more than Japan in our case, because we were Jewish, it was long lasting and it was virulent. But at length it died down. I remember when I went to Germany in 1963, I carried with me many of those old attitudes, even though the war had been over for 18 years. And I was still searching, for those attitudes among the German people. But of course, all of that subsided, and, naturally friendship develops among souls, and I've worked very closely with German people, obviously, and but the Christ had his hands full. Okay, so the hate of those who suffered, it has to be offset. How could it be done? It was so. It was so virulent. Let's just say. How can this be done? Well, again, the power of the Christ is involved. Such are some of the problems with which the Christ is wrestling. We sometimes think of him as the all-powerful conqueror of every condition which besets a human being, but that's against the law, The Syrian law of freedom demands that everyone have free will and work out his own salvation, albeit with the help of the superiors, of course. He must work through his disciples, and they must be trained. Those are masters we're talking about now. So this involves the training of the masters. He must work through the stimulation of the hearts of the intelligent people and of the humanitarians everywhere. He must pour out the life-giving energy of the Christ life on a wide scale throughout the entire world. In a way, it's a tremendous second ray activity. And in doing so, and do so in the midst of those conditions wherein human receptivity and sensitivity are at their lowest point. I mean, people had been dulled by the war. You know how violence can prevent you from taking more in. And do so under those conditions wherein human receptivity and sensitivity are at their lowest point, owing to the numbness which comes through the intense suffering. Okay, I didn't read ahead, but that's exactly it. He stands in his place, unmoved and unafraid, with clear perception of the truth and spiritual insight into the true situation. In collaboration with his great brother, the Buddha, he is preparing for the next step. So, okay, we see what the Christ did. And, every once in a while I stand amazed at the particular steps he took, which were of such fundamental importance. and a bit of how he guided as commander of the forces of light, how he guided the United Nations, the Allied powers, to victory, and how he guided humanity through the dangerous conditions which had been let loose upon them, and how he preserved the future for them so that they would not descend into revenge. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, let's just say the treatment by the United States of Germany and of Japan, all for there were some selfish reasons too, but were anything but hatred. They helped these nations rebuild economically. They have done so, and they've contributed considerably to the world economy and to the general world cultures. 75 years ago, okay, maybe this did not seem possible. But under the Christ guidance, it was possible. I'm looking ahead, and it looks like we're coming into a new section. And I've almost done some, 2 hours here. Not quite. I always like it to end up close to the rounded off time, but it doesn't always do so. We're on page 437, and we have to go back a bit. Thanks for your patience. Let's see. So this is where we began, 423, and it goes to, 423, that's the end, and beginning 423 to 437. And our work is on March 19th, and we're very close now to the equinox, and 2 hours or 1 hour, and maybe, I don't know, 1 hour and 55 minutes, maybe 2 hours, it depends. So I will capture this and then descend to page 437, and I hope that my disk, which is spinning in a noisy way, is not interfering with what you hear. Every once in a while, under a lot of use, these things start wearing out, So approximately 1 hour and 55 minutes. And let's see, if I can speak longer, or maybe 2 hours. And 423, it would be 431 to 437. That would make more sense. Okay, 437. And we will begin here at 437 on a date unknown. And it will be number 44, the program, and we just don't know what this will be, so that 1 doesn't belong there, XX belongs there, and XX minutes belong there. And I think I need to, this program ended, and basically 423 to 4, yeah, it's not that. It's 431. There we go. Now we're correct. It's a very different book. Different from the more academically written treatises. I'm looking ahead at the possibility of being able to offer some commentary on letters on occult meditation and maybe telepathy and the etheric vehicle. And I've done some spotty work, but a lot of work really in esoteric psychology 1 and 2. And there is a complete commentary on the astrology book and a complete, almost complete written commentary on the rays and the initiations with a little bit of a video commentary at the end. Really, there's quite a bit to study. What's the use? Well, we're given this advanced writing of the Tibetan. It's not easy to interpret, and everybody has to find a way to interpret it in their own manner. However, we go to class sometimes. I've held a lot of classes, and some of you have as well, and we discuss these things, and we take the Tibetan's words and we offer our lesser interpretation, but after all, it is our interpretation, and we have to learn how to think for ourselves. So I'm just a student of these things, and I offer my interpretations, my connections, what I see as relevant, missing many things, of course, and maybe sometimes missing the Tibetan's point altogether, but offering for a class-like situation some thoughts which may help the students digest this material. I don't suspect that my words will necessarily be played in class necessarily. I would suspect that maybe some things that are said would be isolated by the teacher, and the time at which they occurred would be noted, and one could go there, and then my explanation could be made audible and visible for the class. That I expect. But what I would hope is that before, during, in between, such classes, that the individual students could take the time to listen to some of this material and see if it stimulates thoughts in them. We just don't know where such stimulation will come from. Any word, any phrase, any sentence, any paragraph can provide a trigger of connection, a trigger which leads to connectivity between various items of thought, and then the light will break through. It's going to be different for everybody, just as it is different when we read the Tibetan in its pure form. Different thoughts will be stimulated and different arcs of light will appear. But some additional explanation can be necessary for students, and I found them useful too, from many people who, reading the Tibetan, offered additional explanation, and that's what I'm trying to do. As this book is unusual because it's more a collection of articles and pamphlets covering a period of time in which humanity engaged in a great war. Now, if we were to, let's see, if I go all the way back, I see what I've done, you see. I've started at page 61, but if I were to go right here to the externalization of the hierarchy, and I were to go to the book immediately before it, okay, let's see how, well, just the beginning, let's see, the externalization of the hierarchy. The great invocations are presented, and we start with 1934, which was really 5 years before I started my analysis of these things. And I will go back and try to catch this, because before the time that I entered, which was more or less at the time of the the beginning of the war, Poland was being invaded and so forth, there was quite a big emphasis upon other things. And even this is taking place, well, let's see, the general world picture. Yeah, he gets into the pre-war time quite quickly, from 1934, and then going backwards here, 1934 to 1938. That's quite a jump, isn't it? And then maybe he continues with 1938. Well, that's where I left off. That's where I began with the immediate task. So basically, I'm going to be handling this 1934 article or essay or whatever we want to call it. Is there something else in here? It's talking about, many, many things which are of importance, but which are not directly affected by the gathering war clouds. So that will be my work after I finish the book, and then we can, it's the work of the C groups, which will be important from page 47 to page 61, and then the 1934, it looks like the 1934 essay. Don't get dizzy now here, I'm just trying to see what's really here. Everything the Tibetan says is of value because, it's the seed group work that he expands upon all the way from page 26 to around page 61, 62. So there's a 1938 essay, there's a 1937 essay, and let's see, a 35 essay. Not a long one at all. Please give us your aid. It's time when the new great invocation was coming out. And here, a 1934 essay. And we're getting quite close now to the very first essay or pamphlet or article, however they did appear. So basically, it looks like 4 essays. Yep, I'll say that. And I'll make a note here that, I don't want that. Okay, I'll just say this, that 4 essays, 4 articles, essays, pamphlets, how do you spell that? P-A-M-P-H-L-E. Pamphlets appear before the point at which I entered on page 61. So these 4 will be taken care of when the time comes, and I never know how long it will take to get through that. We still have quite a few pages, and the conference is coming up, and let's just say we're somewhere here. Yeah, we're right here. Okay. We're, approximately at 583. We're more than halfway through the book, fortunately for us. And this is where we are. We're on page 588 and about 860 something. Let's see, about 300 pages remain. Of course, I am making things bigger, more expanded, and so forth. So it's impossible to tell, but we are more than halfway through. Okay, well, then our next work is on program number 44, whenever that's going to be taken up. And I can't even tell, it could be even months from now. But we will try to make our way through because such a wonderful vision of what is possible in the new age is presented, and we are on the threshold of a new presentation. So, in fact, this lasts approximately 2 hours and 5 minutes or 6 minutes, and we'll see how long the next one's lasts. Okay, thank you for your participation, living through this great Armageddon and trying to see how the outer events and the inner causes are correlating with each other. Many blessings, lots of love. We'll see you soon, and let's just keep on keeping on, as they say, you know? Okay, bye-bye.